Samuel was a quiet young rancher who lived alone on the wide open land of the Wild West. His days were long, filled with feeding his horses, fixing fences, and riding across miles of dry land to check on his cattle. He liked the silence of the plains, though sometimes he wished he had someone to share it with. The wind often carried nothing but dust, and the sun beat down on him from morning to night. It was a hard life, but Samuel was used to it. He had been raised by his parents on this same land, and when they passed away, he stayed, carrying their dream of keeping the ranch alive. One afternoon, as the sun began to lower and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Samuel rode his horse along a lonely trail. He was heading back from town where he had picked up supplies. The trail was quiet, the only sound the hooves of his horse tapping against the dry ground. He was thinking about the chores waiting for him at home when something unusual caught his eye. At first it looked like a shadow moving across the dirt. Then he noticed it was a person. A figure was stumbling slowly, almost falling with every step. Samuel pulled on the reins of his horse and squinted into the distance. His heart sank when he realized it was a young woman. She looked so weak that she seemed ready to collapse at any moment. Her clothes were torn and dusty, her hair tangled, and her skin pale under the setting sun. She was nothing but skin and bones, like someone who hadn't eaten in days. Samuel urged his horse forward, his eyes fixed on her. When he reached her side, she almost fell over, but Samuel caught her by the arm. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked softly. She tried to answer, but her lips were dry and her voice was so faint that he could barely hear her. Samuel quickly pulled out a small canteen of water from his saddlebag and held it out. She grabbed it with shaking hands, spilling a little as she tried to drink. But then she drank so quickly it was clear she hadn't had water for a long time. "Easy," Samuel said gently, helping her steady the canteen. He reached into his bag again and found a piece of bread he had bought in town. She stared at it for a second, then began eating with small, desperate bites. Watching her, Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He had seen many things in his life, but he had never seen someone look so fragile. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. She lowered the bread slowly and whispered something so soft it almost disappeared into the wind. Samuel leaned closer. "Clara," she said finally, her voice weak but clear enough for him to hear. Samuel nodded. "Well, Clara, you're safe now. I'll take you to my ranch. You need food, rest, and shelter." At first, Clara shook her head as if she didn't want to trouble him, but her legs trembled and Samuel could see she could not go on alone. He carefully helped her onto his horse, lifting her gently as though she weighed nothing at all. She leaned against him, too tired to hold herself straight. Samuel gave his horse a small nudge and they began moving toward the ranch. The ride back was quiet. Clara dozed off at times, her head resting lightly on Samuel's shoulder. He thought about how she must have ended up alone in such a harsh land. The Wild West was unforgiving. Travelers often underestimated the desert heat and the long miles between towns. Without water or help, a person could lose all strength in a matter of days. Samuel wondered what her story was, but he decided not to ask yet. She needed strength before she could share it. By the time they reached the ranch, night had already spread across the sky, and the stars shone bright. Samuel carefully helped Clara down from the horse. She looked around at the small wooden house, the barn, and the corral, her eyes full of weariness but also relief. Inside the house, Samuel guided her to a chair by the table and quickly lit a lantern. The warm glow filled the room, chasing away the shadows. He heated some stew that he had left from earlier in the day and placed it in front of her. Clara looked at the bowl as if it was the most precious thing she had ever seen. She ate slowly this time, taking careful spoonfuls, though Samuel could see the hunger in her eyes. When she finished, he gave her a blanket and pointed toward the small bed in the corner. "You can rest here tonight," he said. "Don't worry about anything else. You're safe." Clara tried to thank him, but her voice broke and tears filled her eyes. Samuel quickly reassured her. "No need for words right now. Rest. Tomorrow we'll talk." She nodded and lay down, pulling the blanket close. In moments, she was asleep, her breathing soft and steady. Samuel sat at the table for a while, watching the lantern flicker. His mind replayed the moment he found her on the trail. If he had been just an hour later, maybe she wouldn't have survived. The thought shook him, but it also filled him with a strange sense of purpose. This fragile young woman had crossed his path for a reason. That night, as the wind whispered outside and the coyotes called in the distance, Samuel promised himself he would take care of Clara until she could stand strong again. She had come to him broken, skin and bones, but something in her eyes told him she was not meant to stay broken forever. There was a hidden strength waiting inside her, and Samuel felt certain that one day she would rise. He didn't know then that the woman sleeping in his small ranch house would soon become the most beautiful and admired lady in the Wild West. All he knew was that he had found someone worth saving, and he would not turn away. The morning light touched the small wooden house as Samuel stepped outside to start his day. He was used to waking early, feeding the horses and checking the cattle before the sun rose too high. But that morning felt different. Inside his home was Clara, the fragile young woman he had rescued from the lonely trail. Samuel wondered if she would even wake, or if her weakness would keep her sleeping all day. When he came back from the barn, he found her sitting at the table, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her hair was messy and her eyes still tired, but there was something new in her face, a quiet relief as if she finally felt safe. Samuel gave her a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said. Clara nodded, her lips forming a small smile of her own. He placed a bowl of warm porridge in front of her. She ate slowly, careful not to waste a single spoonful. Watching her, Samuel thought again about how close she had been to losing her life. The West had no mercy for the weak, and yet here she was, alive, breathing, holding on. When she finished, Samuel sat across from her. "Clara," he said softly, "if you're ready, I'd like to know what happened. How did you end up alone out there?" She lowered her eyes and took a deep breath. Her hands trembled as she held the edge of the blanket tighter. "My family," she whispered. "We were moving west with a wagon. My father believed we would find better land, a better life. But the wagon broke down. Supplies were low. They couldn't carry everyone. I was left behind." Her voice cracked and tears welled in her eyes. "They promised they would send help, but no one came." Samuel's chest tightened. He had heard stories of families abandoning the weakest when the road grew too hard. It was a cruel truth of survival. But hearing Clara say it made his heart ache. She had been left to face the harsh desert sun alone, without food, without water, without hope. "I'm sorry," Samuel said gently. "No one should have to go through that." Clara wiped her tears and shook her head. "You don't need to pity me. I survived until you found me. Maybe that means I was meant to keep living." Samuel admired her spirit. Even in her weakness, she carried a strength he could not ignore. "You're right," he said. "And now you're here. You don't have to face this land alone anymore." The days that followed were not easy. Clara's body was fragile and she often tired quickly. But Samuel made sure she had food, warmth, and rest. He gave her small tasks to help her feel useful, like stirring stew or feeding the chickens. Slowly, she began to grow stronger. At first, Clara could barely lift a bucket of water without stumbling, but Samuel showed her how to carry it in smaller amounts. He didn't laugh at her clumsiness or weakness. Instead, he encouraged her, saying, "Every day you'll get stronger." His calm patience gave her the courage to keep trying. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Sometimes they spoke, and sometimes the silence was enough. Clara shared memories of her family, the songs her mother used to sing, the way her father believed the West held endless promise. Samuel listened quietly, not judging, not interrupting. He shared his own stories, too, about how his parents had built the ranch, how he had been alone since their passing, and how he kept working to honor their dream. The ranch became more than just a place of work. With Clara there, it began to feel alive in a new way. She smiled more often, and Samuel found himself smiling with her. When he came in from the field, she would have water ready for him, or a small meal waiting. These little gestures warmed his heart more than he expected, but not everyone saw Clara the way Samuel did. When he took her into town one day to buy fabric and supplies, people stared. Whispers followed them through the dusty street. Some pitied her, saying she was too frail to survive in such a harsh land. Others warned Samuel that she would only slow him down. "A ranch needs strong hands, not broken ones," an old shopkeeper muttered. Samuel said nothing, but inside he burned with quiet anger. He knew what Clara had endured, and he knew how far she had already come. She was not weak. She was fighting harder than most people ever had to. Back at the ranch, Samuel told Clara not to listen to their words. "The West has a way of hardening people's hearts," he said. "They forget that strength comes in many forms." Clara nodded, though Samuel could see the doubt in her eyes. He decided then that he would help her prove them wrong. He began teaching her skills that every settler in the West needed. He showed her how to ride one of his gentler horses, guiding her hand on the reins. At first she was nervous, holding on tightly, but Samuel reassured her with calm words. "The horse can feel your fear," he explained. "Trust it and it will trust you." Slowly she learned to balance, to guide, to ride with confidence. He also taught her how to use a lasso. Clara laughed the first few times she tried, the rope falling far from the target. But Samuel encouraged her to keep practicing. Day by day her aim grew better, her hands steadier. Soon she could catch a wooden post with surprising accuracy. One evening Samuel placed a rifle in her hands. Clara looked at it nervously, but he guided her gently. "Out here you need to know how to protect yourself," he said. He taught her how to hold it, how to aim, and how to shoot safely. The first time she fired, the noise startled her so much she nearly dropped it. But Samuel steadied her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice calm. "You did well," he said. "Next time you'll be ready." Weeks turned into months, and Clara's body changed. The thin, fragile figure Samuel had carried onto his horse was now standing straighter, her eyes brighter, her steps stronger. She still carried scars of her past, but they no longer defined her. She began to laugh more often, her voice ringing across the ranch like music Samuel hadn't heard in years. The neighbors who visited began to notice too. Where once they had doubted her, now they saw her working alongside Samuel, feeding animals, tending the garden, riding with confidence. Some admitted they had been wrong. Others simply watched in quiet surprise. But Samuel never cared for their approval. What mattered to him was seeing Clara's spirit return. He saw the spark in her eyes when she rode across the field, the pride in her smile when she hit a target with her lasso, the calm strength in her voice when she told him, "I can do this." Clara was no longer the girl who had been left behind, skin and bones, on a lonely trail. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, braver, and more alive. And Samuel knew this was only the beginning of her transformation. Every evening, as the sun set over the wide plains, Samuel would watch her from a distance. He could see how far she had come, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude that fate had placed her in his path. Clara was no longer just surviving. She was living, and the West, harsh as it was, could not break her anymore. As the weeks rolled into months, Clara's life on the ranch changed more than even she could have imagined. The fragile girl Samuel had lifted onto his horse was now standing tall beside him, her cheeks filled with color, her eyes clear and full of light. Every day the ranch seemed to echo with her energy. Samuel sometimes caught himself stopping in his work just to watch her move about with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. She had found her rhythm on the ranch. At sunrise, Clara was the first to step outside, her hair tied back, her hands ready for the day's work. She would feed the chickens, sweep the porch, or prepare breakfast before Samuel came in from the barn. Her laughter, once rare, now filled the quiet mornings, making the little wooden house feel more like a home than it ever had before. One morning, Samuel watched as Clara carried 2 buckets of water from the well, her arms steady and strong. A few months earlier, she had stumbled with even a single bucket. Now she moved gracefully, determined not to spill a drop. When she noticed Samuel watching, she smiled proudly as if to say, "See, I told you I could do it." Samuel nodded, smiling back. He admired her spirit more with each passing day. It wasn't just her body that had grown stronger. It was her will, her courage, her belief in herself. Clara had also learned to ride with ease. She and Samuel often rode side by side across the open plains, the horses galloping beneath them, the wind brushing their faces. At first she had been afraid of falling, gripping the reins tightly. But now she rode with freedom, guiding her horse with a gentle hand, her laughter carrying across the wide land. Sometimes she would turn to Samuel and shout with joy, "I never thought I could feel this alive again." Samuel's heart swelled at those moments. He had given her food and shelter, but it was Clara who had given herself back the gift of life. The townsfolk began to notice her transformation as well. When Samuel and Clara went into town to trade or buy supplies, people who once pitied her now stopped and stared in admiration. "Is that the same girl?" they whispered. "The one he found half dead on the trail?" Clara would hear the whispers but hold her head high, her steps graceful, her presence strong. She was no longer the girl who had been abandoned. She was someone new. Despite their whispers, Clara didn't let the attention go to her head. She stayed humble, working hard every day. She never forgot how Samuel had found her, weak and broken. She carried that memory not as shame, but as a reminder of how far she had come. Evenings were her favorite time. After long days of work, she and Samuel would sit by the fire. Sometimes they shared stories. Sometimes they simply sat in silence watching the flames dance. Clara often found herself looking at Samuel, wondering why he had chosen to help her when others might have walked away. One night she asked him softly, "Why did you stop for me that day? Why didn't you just ride past?" Samuel looked at her, his eyes steady. "Because I couldn't," he said simply. "I couldn't leave someone to suffer when I had the power to help." Clara's eyes grew misty. She whispered, "You saved me." Samuel shook his head gently. "You saved yourself. I just gave you the chance." Those words stayed with her. She realized he was right. She had chosen to keep going, chosen to fight for her life even when everything seemed lost. Samuel had given her food and shelter, but she had done the hardest part. She had kept hope alive. As her body grew stronger, so did her confidence. She practiced with the rifle until her aim was steady. Samuel set up bottles on the fence for her to hit, and she learned to fire without fear. At first, she missed more than she hit, but each time she tried, she improved. One evening, she knocked down 3 bottles in a row. Samuel clapped his hands proudly, and Clara laughed, feeling a thrill of accomplishment. She also began to take more responsibility around the ranch. She learned to mend fences, care for the cattle, and even handle accounts when Samuel sold goods in town. She wanted to be useful, not just cared for. Samuel admired her determination. She was no longer someone he needed to protect. She was becoming his partner. But Clara's transformation wasn't just noticed by Samuel or the townsfolk. The ranch itself seemed to bloom with her presence. The once quiet, lonely house was now full of life. Flowers grew in the small garden she tended. Meals were shared with laughter, and evenings ended with songs she sang softly. Songs she remembered from her childhood. Even the animals seemed calmer around her, as if they too felt the warmth she carried. There were moments, however, when Clara still felt the weight of her past. At times she woke in the night, trembling from dreams of being left behind on the trail. Samuel would hear her stir and sit quietly nearby until she calmed. He never forced her to speak about those nights, but his presence was enough to reassure her she was not alone anymore. One particular day stood out as proof of her growth. A storm swept across the plains suddenly, with strong winds and heavy rain. The cattle grew restless, and Samuel rushed outside to keep them from breaking the fences. Clara, instead of hiding inside, pulled on her boots and ran after him. She helped guide the frightened animals back, her voice steady and clear. She tied ropes, closed gates, and worked alongside Samuel until the storm passed. When they finally stood soaked to the skin, Samuel looked at her in amazement. "You handled that better than some cowhands I know," he said with a laugh. Clara laughed too, though she was shivering. "I told you I'm stronger now." Samuel knew she was right. As days turned into months, Clara's reputation grew. People in town no longer saw her as a frail girl rescued by chance. They began to respect her as a woman of the West, someone who had faced hardship and risen above it. Some called her the miracle girl, while others admired her beauty, which had blossomed with her strength. But those who knew her best understood that her true beauty was not just in her face, but in her courage, her resilience, and the kindness she carried in her heart. Samuel, quietly watching her each day, felt a deep pride he could not put into words. He had not set out to change her life, but in helping her, he had found his own life transformed too. His ranch was no longer a place of silence and loneliness. It was now filled with light, warmth, and the laughter of a woman who had once been nothing but skin and bones, and was now stronger, braver, and more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The Wild West had shaped her, tested her, nearly broken her, but Clara had risen from the dust, proving to herself and to everyone else that she belonged. And though the journey was far from over, one thing was clear. Clara was no longer just surviving. She was living with strength, purpose, and grace, and Samuel knew the world had only begun to see the woman she was becoming. The summer sun burned high over the plains when the news of a fair in the nearby town reached Samuel and Clara. It was the largest gathering the county held each year, with games, food, music, and traders who came from miles away. Samuel thought it might be good for Clara to see more of the world beyond the ranch. She had grown so much stronger and more confident, and he wanted her to feel the joy of being part of something bigger. Clara was unsure at first. "I don't know if I belong there," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "People still look at me like I'm different." Samuel shook his head gently. "They'll see you for who you really are now. You've worked hard, Clara. You deserve to walk through that town with your head held high." She smiled shyly, but deep down she wondered if he was right. She had become strong, yes, but stepping into a crowd after being whispered about for so long still made her nervous. The morning of the fair, Samuel surprised her with a gift. It was a simple dress, light blue in color with a soft ribbon to tie around her waist. Clara held it in her hands, her eyes wide. She hadn't worn anything new in years. "Samuel," she whispered, "I can't accept this. You've already done so much for me." He gave her a kind smile. "It isn't much, but I thought you should have something fine to wear, something that matches who you've become." Tears touched Clara's eyes as she nodded and held the dress close. When she put it on, she hardly recognized herself. Her reflection in the small cracked mirror showed a woman she never thought she could be. Her hair, brushed neatly, framed her face, and the color returned to her cheeks made her look alive, almost glowing. She was no longer the fragile girl found on the trail. She was Clara, strong and graceful. The ride into town was filled with anticipation. Samuel guided the wagon while Clara sat beside him, the ribbon of her dress fluttering in the breeze. As they entered the town square, music and laughter filled the air. Children ran about with sticky sweets in their hands, and stalls lined the streets selling everything from fabric to tools. But the moment Clara stepped down from the wagon, silence seemed to fall. People who remembered her frail figure, the girl who once could barely stand, now stared in astonishment. Whispers rose quickly. "Is that her? The same girl? She looks so different. Like a lady from the city." Clara felt the weight of their eyes, but instead of shrinking back, she lifted her chin. Samuel offered his arm, and she placed her hand on it with quiet confidence. Together they walked into the fair. At the pie stall, an older woman who had once doubted Clara's survival now smiled warmly. "You look wonderful, dear," she said. "I hardly recognized you." Clara thanked her politely, her voice steady. At another stall, men tipped their hats with admiration, their faces full of respect. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like the subject of pity. She felt like she belonged. Later that afternoon, a small competition was announced in the town square. Riders were invited to show their skill in guiding horses around barrels. Samuel encouraged Clara to try. "You've been practicing," he said with a grin. "Show them what you can do." Clara hesitated, but the sparkle in Samuel's eyes gave her courage. She mounted her horse gracefully, her blue dress flowing as she rode into the square. The crowd watched, many holding their breath. Clara guided her horse with confidence, weaving around the barrels with speed and precision. Her movements were fluid, as if rider and horse were one. When she finished, the crowd erupted in cheers. Children clapped, women smiled, and even the toughest cowhands nodded with respect. Samuel stood proudly at the edge, his heart swelling as he watched her bow her head humbly, accepting their applause. The fair continued with music and dancing as the sun began to set. Lanterns lit the square, and people gathered in circles to laugh and sing. Clara stood among them, her laughter joining theirs, her eyes shining like the stars above. She had never imagined herself in such a moment, surrounded by people who once doubted her, now treating her as if she were one of their own. When a neighbor remarked, "She's the most beautiful woman in the county," Clara blushed and lowered her eyes. Samuel, standing beside her, smiled quietly, knowing beauty was not just in her face but in her spirit. As the evening drew to a close, Samuel and Clara walked back to the wagon. The town was still alive with music, but Clara was lost in thought. She looked at Samuel and whispered, "I never thought I could be seen like that. I never thought people would cheer for me." Samuel placed his hand gently over hers. "Clara, it's because you've shown them what strength looks like. You've earned every bit of their respect." On the ride home, the night was filled with silence, but it was a peaceful silence. Clara looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of pride she had never known. She thought back to the day Samuel found her on the trail, nothing but skin and bones. The memory was sharp, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it reminded her of how far she had come. Back at the ranch, Clara removed the ribbon from her dress and placed it carefully in a small wooden box. She wanted to keep it safe, not because of its worth, but because of what it represented, a turning point in her life. Samuel watched her with quiet admiration. He didn't need to say much. The light in Clara's eyes told him everything he needed to know. She had not only survived, she had risen. In the days that followed, people in town continued to speak of her. They called her graceful, strong, even beautiful. But for Clara, the true victory was not in their words. It was in how she felt inside. She no longer saw herself as the abandoned girl on the trail. She was a woman who had built herself anew with her own hands, her own will, and with the kindness of one man who believed she was worth saving. Each evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains with shades of gold and red, Clara stood on the porch of the ranch, looking out at the wide open land. Her dress might not always be fine. Her hands might be rough from work, but she carried herself with grace, and anyone who saw her knew they were looking at someone remarkable. The woman who had once been skin and bones, now the heart of the Wild West. Years passed on the ranch, but time only made Clara's story more remarkable. She was no longer remembered as the girl Samuel had carried half dead from the trail. People now knew her as a woman of strength, beauty, and courage, someone who had faced the hardest trials of the Wild West and come out shining. The townsfolk often told newcomers about her, as if she were a legend, a symbol of survival and grace. Clara herself never boasted about what she had become. She still worked hard every morning, rising with the sun to care for the animals, tend the garden, and prepare meals. Her hands were strong, her back straight, and her eyes full of life. What changed was the way she carried herself. She walked with pride, not arrogance, and with kindness toward everyone she met. Samuel, who had been at her side from the beginning, often watched her from across the ranch. He remembered the fragile figure he had found on that lonely trail, skin and bones barely breathing. Sometimes he had to remind himself that the woman standing proudly before him now was the same person. Clara had grown into someone greater than even he had imagined. The ranch itself had prospered too. With Clara's help, Samuel expanded the fields, cared for more cattle, and brought more life into the land. What was once a quiet, lonely place had become full of warmth and laughter. Neighbors visited more often, drawn not only by the good work Samuel and Clara did, but also by the joy that seemed to fill the air around them. Clara became known for her generosity. If a traveler passed by, she would offer food and water. If a neighbor fell ill, she would ride out with medicine or cook meals for their family. Her kindness spread across the county, and people began to say, "Clara has a heart as wide as the plains." But what made her most admired was not only her kindness. It was her spirit. She had once been left behind to die, but now she was proof that a person could rise again with courage and determination. Young girls looked up to her, and even the toughest cowhands respected her. Some men in town spoke of her beauty openly, saying she was the most beautiful woman in the Wild West. But those who truly knew her understood that her beauty came from more than her face. It came from the fire in her heart and the strength in her soul. Clara herself often thought back to her journey. She remembered the hunger, the thirst, the loneliness of the trail, but instead of pain, she now felt gratitude. She was thankful she had survived long enough for Samuel to find her. She was thankful for his kindness and patience, and most of all, she was thankful she had chosen not to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. One evening, as the sun painted the horizon with shades of gold and red, Clara stood on the porch beside Samuel. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of wildflowers across the plains. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" she asked quietly. Samuel looked at her, his eyes gentle. "I don't let myself wonder," he said. "All I know is that I did, and it changed both our lives." Clara smiled, her eyes misty. "It did, more than I can ever put into words." From that day forward, she began to share her story more openly. When neighbors gathered or when young women asked her how she became so strong, Clara told them the truth. She told them how she had been abandoned, how she had nearly lost everything, and how she had risen again with Samuel's help. But she never told it to gain pity. Instead, she told it to give hope. "It doesn't matter where you start," she would say gently. "It matters where you choose to go. It matters who you decide to become." Her words touched many hearts. Some who had struggled found strength in her story. Others who had lost hope found light again. Clara's life became more than her own. It became an example to others, a reminder that even in the harshest land, beauty and strength could grow. Samuel felt proud whenever he heard her speak. He knew that while he had given her food, water, and shelter, It was Clara's own spirit that had carried her forward. She had done the hardest part herself. Over time, Clara and Samuel built not only a ranch but a life together. They faced storms, droughts, and the challenges of the West, but they faced them side by side. Their bond was strong, not because life had been easy, but because they had survived hardship together. Travelers who passed by often carried stories of the ranch with them. They told of a woman once skin and bones, now the most beautiful and respected woman in the Wild West. They told of a rancher who had seen her worth when no one else did. And they told of the life they built, full of courage, kindness, and love. In the quiet moments, when the stars stretched endlessly above them, Clara sometimes thought of the girl she once was, the one stumbling alone on the trail, weak and forgotten. She would close her eyes and whisper to that girl in her heart, "You made it. You survived. Look at who you became." And every morning when the sun rose over the endless plains, she stepped into the day with strength and grace, knowing she had turned her pain into power, her weakness into beauty, and her despair into hope. Clara had once been a forgotten figure on a lonely road, but now she was a shining light in the West. People spoke her name with respect. Children looked at her with admiration, and Samuel stood beside her with quiet pride. She was living proof that even in the harshest of places, a broken life could be rebuilt into something extraordinary. The Wild West would always be rough, always unforgiving, but for Clara it had become the place where she found herself. And for those who knew her story, she was not just a woman of beauty. She was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of the human spirit. She had been skin and bones when Samuel found her. Now she was the most beautiful woman in the Wild West, not just in looks but in every way that truly mattered.